This is Judaism Unbound, episode 503, Jewish Music. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And today we're excited to be kicking off a series of episodes on the topic of Jewish music, past, present, and future. We'll be featuring a terrific group of guests, some of whom are prominent musicians who create music you may have already sung with your communities, and others who are specialists in ethnomusicology, who can help us better understand what Jewish music did and how it functioned in the past and what it does and how it functions today, and of course how it might function tomorrow. Listeners have asked us to explore Jewish music over the years, but we didn't quite know how to do it. It's tough to talk about music sometimes instead of just singing together, but we're going to give it a try. We also think that these expansive conversations about music will intertwine very directly with other themes that we discuss often on this show, and that they'll be relevant to all sorts of other Jewish topics. Our first guest in this series is Elana Arian. She actually deserves credit for helping this unit come to be because she sent us an email a while ago with a whole vision of what a set of conversations like this could look like. We're grateful to her for that vision, and we're hopeful that this series will be a meaningful one for you. But before we dive in, Lex, can you share this week's Judaism Unbouncements with us?
I can. First and foremost, a practical unbouncement. Dan's audio is not ideal today. There was some travel mayhem, basically, leading to Dan needing to record this episode in an airport on a phone. And so his track is not as great as usual. We apologize for that. Now for the non-practical unbouncements. We've got Judaism Inbound, Judaism Unbound's Intro to Judaism class, which began last Tuesday. But if you're hearing this, you can still sign up. But this is truly the very last chance you can. So we allow folks to sign up between the first and second class of Judaism Inbound, and then you can watch the recording of the first one and catch up. So you can head to judaismunbound.com/classes to register. But truly, if you don't in the next couple days before the second class occurs on Tuesday, October 7th, you will not be able to register anymore. So definitely head to judaismunbound.com/classes right now. Financial aid is available. Also, we have 4 other classes that have not begun yet but will be in a few weeks. Financial aid available for those as well. There's Anti-Semitism Unbound with Shoshana Brown, Jewish Liberation and Exile with Chava Shapiro, Jubilees with me, and Talmud Unleashed with Olivia Devora Tucker. We're so thrilled to feature all these awesome teachers, and again, hope that you will register at judaismunbound.com/classes. Last unbouncement, Shabbat Unbound, our year-long Shabbat service where we hone in on one prayer each month, begins next week. So this episode is coming out on October 3rd, and our first Shabbat Unbound of the year is October 10th. We will be kicking off our year-long service. We hope that you will register at judaismunbound.com/Shabbat. We'll be connecting once a month, journeying our way through the Shabbat service from now through just under a year from now. So we hope that you will attend. Now back to Dan.
Awesome. So now a bit about our guest today, Elana Arian. Elana Arian is a composer, multi-instrumentalist, and prayer leader who has become one of the most important voices in contemporary Jewish music. She is a nationally touring artist serving 30 to 40 distinct communities every year, and her music has become an important part of Jewish life across the globe. Elana Arian has released 5 albums of original music to date. Her most recent, released earlier this year, is entitled If We Loved Like That. She is also the subject of a dedicated composers anthology by Transcontinental Music Publications, also published in 2025. Elana Arian has performed at Carnegie Hall, Lincoln Center, Tanglewood, and perhaps most memorably, 5 separate appearances at the White House in the Obama years. Before becoming a star in the Jewish music world, Elana Arian spent a decade as a touring artist in the folk indie scene, opening regularly for Girly Man, David Wilcox, Katie Curtis, and many more. She's appeared on NPR's Soundcheck as well as on PBS's Finding Your Roots. She is also a sought-after studio musician working with artists such as Peter Yarrow, the Dirty Projectors, and Katie Curtis. On Broadway, she's held the guitar chair on both the revival of Sweet Charity, starring Tony Award winner Sutton Foster, and on Kristen Chenoweth's acclaimed For the Girls. She's also worked on multiple instruments in pit orchestras of many Broadway shows. Elana Arian studied conducting, violin, jazz guitar, and songwriting at Yale. We're excited to kick off our series on Jewish music, so Elana Arian, thanks for getting us started. Welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you. Elana Arian, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
Thanks for having me. What a great thing to be here.
Well, in this unit, I really wanted to get started with this question of how one becomes a Jewish musician. And I suppose everyone becomes a Jewish musician in a different way. So I'm wondering how you became a Jewish musician, if that's even the right terminology. But I was particularly intrigued because I saw that you've been a musician on Broadway and in all kinds of other circumstances. And I'm wondering, what was your path and what did you intend to be? And was this it?
I love that framing of what did you intend to be and was this it? I don't know. Most people I come into contact with are something wonderful that they didn't intend to be. Yeah, I've been a musician really. I've identified as a musician my whole life, much longer than as a Jewish musician. And I think that that's an important part of my path, just that music was really in my home and in my life, and particularly Jewish music forever. My parents are both lifelong makers of Jewish music and song leaders, and my mom is still a professor at Hebrew Union College, teaching mostly in the cantorial school. And so my dad dedicated his life to Jewish camp. So I grew up in a song session, in the dining hall with the chairs shaking and stuff. And that music is probably the oldest musical DNA that I have and the most core to my childhood memories. And because I grew up at camps, I picked up guitar that way, like different song leaders in different camps teaching me a chord here and there. And my parents both play guitar. My mom's a pianist. So that kind of music was always part of my life, folk music and guitar and singing. And my primary trained instrument is violin. I'm a classically trained violinist. So I kind of went up through into college thinking that I certainly would be a musician and maybe I'd be like in a symphony or something. And I, in college, kind of fell in, as you do with, a merry band of misfit music makers. Shout out.
That is not what people usually fall into in college, for what it's
Yes.
worth. Like when you hear the sentence "in college I fell
Right,
into,"
exactly.
it does not always end with merry
That's
musicians.
a good point.
I
That's
love
a
it.
very wholesome. It's a very wholesome end to the sentence.
Although I think the musically inclined do, like you, Lex, you fell into a
That's true, Lex.
very
We have
band
that
of
in
music
common.
makers.
I guess so. There's just like all these holes around that we're falling into stuff, and it's just yielding music. I guess there's like a drum at the bottom. I don't
Absolutely.
know.
Absolutely, there is. So I was doing like a ton of classical music making in college, and then about halfway through, I started singing with sort of a proudly not a cappella group, but like of the a cappella scene in my school, it was like a folk singing group, people playing guitars and mandolins and banjos and singing kind of 60s American folk music. And because of that, I had a lot of friends from that group who were just writing their own music. And it was something that had not occurred to me somehow, even though I grew up on that music, Joni Mitchell and James Taylor and all that. And so I started writing my own music in college. And by the time I graduated, I was moving back to New York. I grew up in Westchester and I moved back to the city to make it as a folk singer. So I was doing that kind of music making for a little over a decade. So I was playing in New York and recording my first album and, teaching guitar lessons and violin lessons as my way of making money. And because of my parents' professional work and my dad's relationships to camping and stuff, Debbie Friedman of blessed memory was, just a friend of my family's and a presence in my life. And as a supportive friend, she used to come and hear me play in these like god awful clubs in New York, like the ones that give you those early gigs are pretty gross. And so she would come, in the middle of a Wednesday afternoon and hear me play. And she just started right away from the beginning, like, hey, that was great, something nice about something. And then how about writing some Jewish music, and what do you think about that? And I just had that knee jerk early 20s thing of like, no, thank you. I was touched by it, but very much like, oh, I'm definitely never doing that. Like, thank you. And that sort of started this ongoing dynamic between us of her kind of pushing me in this direction and my really resisting that. I really was just kind of like, that's not for me for years and years and years. And it really took until I was a brand new parent, like I have two kids and my oldest daughter was born in 2013, really just in a very unusual for me moment of spontaneous prayer and calling out, found myself kind of singing a prayer, as I was changing my daughter, from the end of the Amidah, Yehi L'Ratzon Imrefi V'Hegion Libi Lefanecha, may the things that I'm struggling with, may my anxieties be okay and be acceptable. I was at the time, I had just begun playing violin in the Shabbat ensemble at Central Synagogue in Manhattan. And I shared that piece with the clergy there, and they asked me to share it with the congregation. And I just had a really different experience doing that than I did all of the clubs that I was playing, for that decade, which eventually were nicer clubs that were, it wasn't as gross to be there. It was a feeling of embracing and allowing in this piece of myself that I had really been pushing and really resisting and really sort of living in that tension, and such a relief, to like let all the parts in. And that was 12 years ago. And that was really the beginning of this completely other chapter of my life. Although Jewish music has always been sort of my way into Judaism, it's become my primary sort of form of service, I think, in the Jewish community. It's become a big part of my teaching, sort of the core of my professional and spiritual life. And it really came from learning how to let go of resisting and pushing away the parts of myself that didn't feel like what I in my brain wanted to be doing. But, there's other parts of us that take over.
Yeah. So, I mean, there were a lot of beautiful it's at the end of that response. You said, it's become, a core part of what I bring to the world. There were, I don't remember all of them, but listeners can rewind and hear them again. The it there is Jewish music. That's the antecedent. It's a really funny phrase. Like, we don't think about this very much. Like, there are genres of music, right? Like, if you talk about classical music, I mean, you mentioned, a cappella versus not a cappella,
right.
There's ska and there's reggae and there's rock and there's rap. And like, if you ask somebody who is a performer of one of these genres what those genres are, they can talk to you about like characteristics of the music that make it roughly fit into that genre. And like, it's not that any genre is hard and fast and there's blurring of genres, but like Jewish music isn't like that, right? Like, you can't just hear a random set of notes and instrumentations happening and be like, Jewish. Correct. Now, that doesn't stop people from doing it. Like, there are certain sounds that people hear that people associate with Jewish music, but the way that you bring things melodically, if you took out all the words, and not just you, like a lot of contemporary Jewish music, I don't know that people would automatically know that they're hearing Jewish music unless it was like set to a prayer or in a Jewish building. Like, I'd love to hear you distill what that it is. Like, what, when we're talking about Jewish music, because you teach in, a school of Jewish music, of sacred music, what do we mean? Like, on some level, if I sing anything in the context of a Jewish ritual, I feel like it has become Jewish music, right? And there's a long history of that precise thing happening, right? Like, if you look at the history of some of, our favorite wordless melodies, favorite nigunim, it's often like, it was a song people sang in bars secularly, right. And then it made its way, and like, all of a sudden, boom, it's Jewish music. And so I'm kind of curious, like, is that the best we can do? Like, what is Jewish music? And I guess also we can start to open up, what does it do?
Two great and gigantic questions, I think. Yeah, I think the question of what is Jewish music and the idea that it can't be defined easily as a genre in the way that, basically any other genre that I can think of, that I'm aware of, can, is a little bit related to a lot of the existential and political and broader sort of conversations about what's a Jew, in the same way that, like, okay, if you see in your mind's eye, a Satmar Jew in Brooklyn, right, with a particular Hasidic look and particular, payas, forelocks, and a hat or whatever, that's a Jew, right? And we also know that, like, you're a Jew and you look how you look, and I'm a Jew and I look how I look. And I think part of the reason that it's very difficult to pin down collection of a real multitude of sounds and melodies and rhythms even is because of what the sort of cultural nature of being Jewish, which is that it is not one thing. It's an almost infinite number of things because of the way we've sort of scattered and regathered across the globe and through cultures. And that's unique. Christian rock, for example, which is a gigantic millions, hundreds of millions of streams a year musical genre, has a sound to it. It's defined. It doesn't represent, I don't think, every branch of Christianity. I'm speaking way outside of my expertise now. But musically, if I like the sound of one song that comes up and it's labeled as Christian rock, I can go to a playlist and hear music that is that sound because it's a very defined stream. And in some ways, I think Jewish music is as difficult as it is to define, even just from a musical perspective, because of how difficult it is to define a Jew. What is it to be culturally Jewish? What is it to be quote unquote observant? And all of that kind of feeds into what are the creative, musical, theatrical, what are those expressions that feel sort of characteristically Jewish? And it's complex, I think, just because exactly of the kind of people we are. Like I recently got to see Alex Edelman, that wonderful comedian, trying out some new material. And now that is a Jewish comedian, obviously, right? This is a comedian who grew up in a traditionally observant household and has lots of material that's about Jewish experience and Jewish, what it's like to grow up, particularly for him in like an observant household in like a sort of secular part of Boston and all that stuff.
He actually officiated a friend of mine's wedding.
Oh my
So
God.
like he's held like that Jewish ritual role
Amazing.
even.
That's so, oh, I'd have loved to see that. But like, I feel like that's a perfect example. Or even someone like Sarah Silverman, it's like, those are really Jewish, like those are Jewish comedians, I'm sort of making an exaggerated face right now, but it's not because they're necessarily doing jokes about like something that happened in shul or like some kind of fun cultural stereotypes that we can laugh at ourselves about. There's an essential quality to sort of like the delivery, the structure, the form and the content is somehow in their cells Jewish, even if the jokes are not about that at all. And in some ways, I think that's a question that's at play with Jewish music. Like you said, if you're Jewish and you're singing this song in a context that's a Jewish context, is it Jewish music or is it just a Jew singing a song in a Jewish place, And when I started in this work, I definitely felt that tension because I began to be invited to perform in settings of like a festival of Jewish music or a Jewish songwriters night or something when I had maybe written one or two pieces that I considered Jewish music. And I thought, well, I'm not really like a Jewish musician though. I mean, I'm a Jewish musician, but I'm not really necessarily at that time making Jewish music. And it's a question of kind of like, where do we draw that line is really blurry. To me, there's a few things that I know are Jewish music. And then there's a lot of things that work beautifully in Jewish contexts as communal pieces of music that therefore become Jewish music, but maybe did not start that way or weren't intended that way. And in some ways, I think that's one of the most beautiful things about this evolving form. We are open to using all kinds of tools to connect people. And in a particular way, for me, I think Jewish music is music that's for some kind of communal connection, even if it's traditional chazanut, let's say, like that's a form of cantorial singing that's just the person has this incredible gymnastic, amazing improvisatory, florid stuff. It's not what we picture as communal singing, which is maybe people sitting in a close circle and singing a nigun, a wordless melody. But even someone performing an incredible piece of chazanut, the idea of that, and I think some of the thrust of it, is with the purpose of us feeling a communal connection to some kind of old pre-memory, pre-whatever genetic, experience in a shtetl somewhere that maybe my great-great-grandfather heard. And now I'm getting to sort of be connected to that chain.
I think I have a related question, and not that I want to dwell on synagogue music for this whole conversation, but when we think about synagogue music in particular as one genre of Jewish music, I'm almost trying to do a taxonomy in my head. And, I was thinking like, okay, there's kind of like what we tend to see in a conservative synagogue. And we kind of, a lot of us know what that sounds like. Conservative Jews think of that as like the traditional sound of Jewish music, which is fascinating. And then there's kind of this cantorial music that you were describing, which I think people tend to say, well, that sounds like high reform, old reform, although there was a lot of cantorial music in the Orthodox world. And, so that's one genre. And then the other genre is, I don't know what to call it exactly, but it's kind of, I think, what a lot of us think of as Debbie Friedman or Jewish summer camp kind of songs, which we're now used to hearing a lot in contemporary Reform synagogues. But, as I was thinking about that, I was thinking like, in some ways, maybe the main distinction between the denominations is actually the kind of music that you hear in their synagogues. Because frankly, like I've been wondering for many, many years, there's a Reform synagogue and a conservative synagogue in my small neighborhood. And as far as I can tell, there is no difference whatsoever between the members and what they believe about Judaism. Really, the only difference is kind of what sort of music they are used to hearing, and then they ascribe a lot of meaning to that music, like we're more traditional or we're less traditional, even though in some ways, right, the Reform synagogue is actually more traditional in the sense that they're doing chazanut, which was sort of an older form, and the conservative synagogue is actually doing German bar songs, and that's
Yes.
actually a newer, right? And yeah, they sort of imagine it to be flipped. So I guess I'm wondering for your reflections on, kind of how different genres of music play into the world of synagogues.
Oh, yeah. What a great question. And I was vigorously nodding my head when you were saying that, the people in your local Reform and conservative synagogue seem to believe the same things about Judaism, but the distinction comes with what does it sound like in the service? What are the melodies they're singing? And I think it's a really powerful and important point, particularly where we are. I couldn't really define it, but where we are in this current moment in terms of sort of denominational lines and what the place of the synagogue is in the Jewish future and what we can envision or not envision. And I think that a lot of my work throughout any given year is going, as they tend to call it, as an artist in residence, but it's basically like going as a guest scholar to a particular synagogue community, and I'm there, Friday afternoon through Sunday morning, and leading Shabbat worship Friday night, Saturday morning, and Torah study, and I'll usually do a concert after Shabbat and maybe do something with the kids, and so I have like a intensive experience with, let's say, 30 communities a year. And they are primarily Reform communities because that's what I grew up in, and that's kind of the soup that I marinated in, and those are the communities that tend to sing my music mostly. And then like maybe 3 or 4 conservative synagogues a year maybe have me come. And it is one of the sort of incredible experiences when I come into a conservative synagogue, in terms of I teach leading worship at the Reform Seminary, and I play in all these Reform seminaries and lead and work with their clergy teams and help to, I work as a worship consultant and help with, shaping the look and the sound of exactly what you're talking about, synagogue music, and how does it help to elevate the prayer or not. And I find myself oftentimes when I'm first entering into a conservative worship space, not because of the liturgy, like not because of the words at all, but because of the thing when the rabbi says to me, okay, we're going through the order of the service, and then we do the traditional melody for this, and we do the traditional melody for that, and da da da. And it's like you actually do have to ask in every single setting, what is the traditional melody to that? And then it's, in Reform settings, the traditional melody is going to be an 1800s German, exactly what you're talking about, like Sulzer kind of church music. It sounds like church music. Shema Yisrael Adonai, right? That's tradition.
Which people think is thousands of years. They think there's never been any other Shema melody, or like maybe they haven't thought about it.
Yeah, can I jump in with a quick story? This is one of my colleagues shared this incredible story with me that he was at a retreat, a pluralistic retreat with Jews from all sorts of different denominations, and it was coming to time to prepare for the Havdalah service, that ends Shabbat, and they couldn't agree on like which words to say or like which exact parts or whatever. They were disagreeing about elements of it, but they all agreed that we should sing the traditional music, which is which is Debbie Friedman,
which is Debbie,
which is so modern and Reform,
Totally.
in its origins.
100%. And I've been on faculty at pluralistic retreats where the thing that's the baseline thing that everybody can do is like we do the traditional Havdalah, and then it's like, and it's kind of in the Yaidaidas of a different kind of denomination, but it is Debbie's, which is not that long ago. So yeah, I mean, that perfectly illustrates it. I think that the question of what's the traditional melody and what you identified, Dan, as that being kind of one of the places that you could see a difference between your local Reform and conservative synagogue, it's the way in which music, the particular melodies, the particular arrangement of the notes and the particular rhythms and how they're presented gets at the absolute core of the most important kind of Jewish memory that we have. And I think that in some ways, even though I'm sort of the stream of the more contemporary sounding Jewish music, that's the deepest respect that I can have in the field of Jewish music, is people's own sort of feeling of deep ownership and conviction that whatever fill in the blank melody is the traditional one, and how dare you do something different with it. That's about us as Jews being keepers of memory, that we carried this melody from the last place we were kicked out of to the new place. And we can still sing that melody here, even though we don't speak the language and we don't know anything and people don't know us. There's something I think core to us that protects that. I mean, something like Kol Nidre is a perfect example. We know that the words of Kol Nidre are like a legal contract. It's not so meaningful to the moment that we sing them. But there's a reason that nobody is writing a new melody for Kol Nidre. I mean, that's like a peak moment of our Jewish year. You'd think that the Jewish composers would be going for it so that people would be singing their song.
I have a bizarre relationship with I wrote my undergrad thesis on Kol Nidre. It's called More Than Words on a Page. It's very much aligned with what you just said, that it's not about the words. And like, I wrote it because I was so angry about what the words say. Yes. And it actually bothers me that nobody notices the words. But I think the more I dove into it, the more it was clear to me, like, this isn't about words.
What matters about that piece, which is very agitating, I agree with you. Like, it's strange that this peak moment in the Jewish calendar, in what we're told is the holiest day of the year, is not about the words that we're saying. It's about da, da, dee, da, da, dee, da. And that to me is the source text, the object lesson that tells us that the way that we arrange the notes and the way that the rhythms are and the pace of them, I mean, those notes mean that, my grandmother could connect to sitting next to her dad and playing with his, tallis and the smell of his, mentholated cough drops. And I can have my own contemporary resonance, and that's one of those things. It's one of those sacred things that we don't mess with, even though it's not about the text and it's not about the message there. There's something just about memory and what those notes access. And I find myself as a contemporary composer of Jewish music, and not all of my music, but a lot of it lives in the world of synagogues. I find myself in that conversation a lot, obviously, because people are not aware, like you said, Lex, of who wrote different things. And I'm in a weird position as like a 44-year-old person living in New York, where there are some melodies of mine in Reform synagogues that people think are the traditional one. And that's insane. I've only been writing music for Jewish music for 12 years, but
like which ones?
Hine Mato.
Yeah, that's the one I was going to say. Yeah.
There's a few others, but like, that's a funny thing to me. And like, it's delightful to be in the conversation of kind of, for some young people, that's the Hine Matov, that for them, that is the one that they know. And it'll hold whatever memories it holds of being at summer camp or being in Hebrew school or whatever. But the idea of the traditional melody sort of follows me from place to place. And I think it is one of the big questions, just as big as what makes music Jewish.
Yeah, I mean, I've had that same experience with the traditional one, quote unquote. When I worked for the Institute of Southern Jewish Life and I was going to different synagogues for similar like weekend or long weekend situations, it was a fun translation game. And I think one of the most important skills I built over the course of wandering to those different kinds of synagogues is actually learning what different places mean. When I visit a new community, if I want to endear myself to them, it is helpful to know if when they say the traditional one, or to be able to read when they say the traditional one, if they're talking about Oseh Shalom. For some communities, the traditional Oseh Shalom is ba 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 ba. For others, it's ba 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 ba. And for others, recently, this is a newer one, but it's from Nava Tehillah. It's ba 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 ba. And there will be another one that somebody thinks is the traditional one before too long, because as it turns out, every generation, it's nice to have melodies that are kind of yours, but which also feel anciently grounded. We cheat a little. Like we make things new, but then we feel them as ancient. It's like that famous quote, that which is old becomes new, that which is new becomes holy, from Rav Kook. It's so clear that happens, but we don't seem to like to say that. Like we want to think Shema Yisrael Adonai. Like we want to think that's like thousands of years old, even though if you pause and you're like, okay, this does sound like like music I'd recognize in sort of a high church context. That's why, and they were consciously making music that was of their time, It's not that it sounded like church music so much as it sounded like a lot of music at that time in that place. But I'm really glad Dan opened up the piece about how music actually is it's a separator. It's not only a unifier. We love, a lot of us, singing together. And so music is a way where, in a literal sense, we can unify. Like, we can be singing in unison, like singing things together, which creates this sense of a collective something that is beyond just me. Like, that's part of what's happening when you sing in a group, is you're not just you anymore. You're like a component of a broader you that is the room, or a broader we. And that's cool. But I think it's important to say that, like, the main thing separating that conservative synagogue from that Reformed synagogue is whether their core melodies are written by Debbie Friedman or written earlier in the 1900s by folks in Germany, or, by the way, more and more, maybe written by a Joey Weisenberg or some musicians that have become widely beloved in conservative or traditional egalitarian contexts, or even within Reform. You can go to communities and, like, oh, there's the communities that are singing mostly Debbie Friedman and Jeff Klepper. If these names don't mean anything to you listeners, it's okay. You just, there's like the set of folks who came to write their music through the 60s and 70s era of Jewish summer camping. And it's not that they wrote all their melodies then, but a lot of their music is influenced by then. And then you've got people like you. And I have heard people talk about, like, oh, we're going to do the Elana melody. Like, you've gotten first name level in the way that Debbie or Joey, like, there's this intimacy that certain communities feel with their musicians. And I'm saying their musicians, even if they've never set foot there, because that is a way that they're, like, without words, communicating what kind of place they are. And so, going back to the thing of the traditional one, I learned in my travels in the South that there were a couple magical things I could do to connect to certain kinds of spaces. I could sing this melody that many people might not have heard, but many others might love, Let Us Adore, this version of Aleinu, this version of the prayer towards the end of the service, that was really sort of a core melody for a certain generation of largely older, today, 70s and 80s Jews who are in Reform context, not just in the South, but including in the South. And I learned that if I did that melody for them, whatever else I did, they would have this warm fuzzy and come up to me after services and be thrilled about it. And with other communities, if I'm hanging out with, 20-year-olds in a Reform context, if I pull a Dan Nichols melody that they associate with their summer camp, I have the freedom to do a bunch of other things with the rest of my time because I've gotten on their wavelength. Totally. That's what music does. And so I'd love to hear more on, like, it's beautiful, right? But it's also exactly what makes us uncomfortable. Like, we think of a certain melody as the traditional one. We don't know there's other ones. And then we go to some new community, and maybe it's that we grew up at summer camp. Maybe it's not synagogue. And then we go to a beautiful communal singing circle where they all seem to know what's happening, but it's a world of melodies from the Joey Weisenbergs and the Deborah Sachs-Mints and the folks in a certain corner. And all of a sudden I feel like an outsider. So can you talk to us more about that separator, unifier, conflict, or duality?
Absolutely. So beautifully said. And I think there's a lot there. I mean, one thing is just to your insight about singing Let Us Adore. One thing that I experience regularly, almost weekly, traveling to different communities is a desire when I come somewhere. I'm doing planning ahead of time with the clergy team, and I'm trying to ask them, what are their goals? What can I help them accomplish? I'm trying to come and be a tool for their community. And a lot of times people will start from a place of, well, we're planning the service. We want to sing like all your stuff. Like, let's sing all Elana Arian melodies, And I know that that's a terrible idea. I mean, even in places where they sing 8 or 9 of my melodies, like, that's not a great idea because of any number of arguments about different entry points to prayer and offering different textures and offering people different opportunities. And people come to pray for a huge number of different reasons. And we want to, not present something that's the same all the way through. But also, much more importantly, Lex, to your point, because it's a vulnerable space to enter into, whether it's a prayer space or just a communal singing kind of environment that you just described, where the last thing we want is the in-group, out-group thing, or the insider knowledge, outsider knowledge. We want a situation where people can step in. And so every place I go, I'm asking, before we plan anything in the service, what is the thing that we need to keep here, no matter what? I just recently released a new collection of songs, and one of them was a healing prayer, a Mishaberach prayer that was a commission for a community in Houston. And in the Reform world, Debbie Friedman's setting of Mishaberach is literally the lyrics are printed in the Siddur. It's really part of the canon. So there's people who say to me, "Oh, let's do your Mishaberach, let's do your Mishaberach," and it's like that's not my mission at all. Like the idea is that we want to create spaces that where I come in, just like you said, Lex, and I can do whatever I want after this in terms of introducing new melodies, opening people's minds to the idea that some things are traditional and some things aren't, or some things can be looked at a different way or whatever, after I've come to a place of what's our common denominator? What is your traditional melody for this? And let me learn it and let me start with it and let you know I'm one of you. I'm not trying to teach you or make you do something you don't want to do. And, for me, when I'm often most doing that is in prayer situations. And in communal singing that's not based in liturgy, I feel like there's a lot more latitude to be able to sort of open people up to things they're not accustomed to because there's a lot of wordless melody. And so it's a little bit easier. The cerebral editor doesn't get in the way as much. But I think first and foremost, the idea that that I like to approach worship with an idea of, what is really familiar and home to you to start. And then what are some things that I can bring in that will feel resonant? But it's never a good idea to come in and say, oh, yeah, let's do 10 of your melodies or whatever. I think also there's a way in which feeling like your version, whatever version it is, the traditional version to you, again, with the ways in which it's like a portal to another time and a portal to a generation back, or a portal to your childhood, or a portal to whatever your specific memory is to that particular piece. I think that it's quite interesting being a living composer of this music, experiencing that. Of course, most people have no idea where the melodies that we sing come from, that human people wrote them and that they didn't come down with the tablets, from Sinai. I think that even in and of itself is kind of a strange way of dividing and bringing people together. People made these things, just regular people.
Yeah.
And that in some ways helps me if I'm a person who feels very, very bound to this traditional version of whatever prayer, traditional in quotes, to understand. I mean, Lex, the 3 Oseh Shalom melodies that you just sang, which I agree with you, are probably the ones that people feel the most traditional. The first one was Debbie Friedman. Da da dee da dee da da. Okay, so that's not very old. Nurit Hirsch, that's like the 70s in Israel. Da da dee da da dee da da, right? Da da dee da da. And then Nava Tehillah, early 2000s. Really contemporary. All of that is really contemporary. I find that's what the Oseh Shalom Bimramav, that's one of the ones that I know if I go into any space, everybody will feel better because that's like the traditional Oseh Shalom. But that's kind of amazing. That's a person, in our lifetime, a young woman in Israel writing a setting. When you introduce living people into it, or the idea that human hands are at work here, I think there's something kind of intellectually interesting to people about the way that we are sort of interjected into this, what you described, Lex, as like a cheat, that we get to use these ancient words that sort of immediately are imbued with meaning because, they were in the Torah, or because, our great, 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 great grandparents said the same words on this same day of the Jewish calendar. We get this sort of immediacy of this feeling of continuity and of weight and of sacredness and of echoes of generations, that then the music can kind of be whatever in a certain way, right? In the mind of this old and new being brought together. And I think, obviously I don't think the music should be whatever. I have pretty strong feelings about what it is, but Jewish music, particularly music that has some kind of liturgical basis, doesn't have to be music for prayer, but that has text that's ancient Jewish text, has a very unique place of helping people to reflect on, what it means to be here now, alive as a Jew in whatever contemporary space, and how it is immediately connected to these thousands of years of tradition and history.
So when Lex wanted to do this series on music, my initial reaction was like, I don't know anything about music. Like, what questions am I going to ask? And now I kind of see that I'm like the stand-in for the audience members who don't know anything about music. And hopefully Lex is the stand-in for the audience members who do know something about music. And it'll actually work well. And the thing that I'm stuck on from what you both were talking about earlier was when you were talking about the Kol Nidre melody, which is a pretty standard melody that is old, and there aren't really that many, or I don't know if there are any like new melodies for Kol Nidre that are really used. But one thing that struck me as I was thinking about it, that it connected with some stories that I told early on in the history of this podcast, where when my synagogue was interviewing rabbinical candidates, and they were saying that certain things couldn't be done because the bracha, the blessing that was said, meant a certain thing that wouldn't allow for, having a non-Jew say it, for example.
Mhm.
And everybody in the synagogue was like, "That's what it means." Yeah, like, I thought it meant that it's time to read the Torah, in that particular case. And what I'm thinking is like, Kol Nidre, a lot of us say, "Oh, well, it really means that we're, being, we don't have to fulfill our vows and blah blah blah." But I think a lot of people hear that melody, Kol Nidre, and they hear it as it's time to be forgiven. They hear it as like something that a scholar would say that's not what this prayer means at all. And yet it does mean it, because the part that is actually communicating its meaning is not the words, but the melody. And that melody, right or wrong in quotation marks in terms of what people who care about words think that it means. Actually, I guess I'm wondering whether the melody can actually have meaning apart from the words, in a way that it can even contradict the words. And like, if you were gonna, and I guess I'm asking this question to you as a composer of new music, are there ways in which you might sort of pull forward a theme, a musical theme, you think that people understand in a certain way, whether I guess it's a Jewish musical theme or not a Jewish one, or just one from general music theory? And I think a lot of times we often think of Jewish music as bringing forward words from the Torah or words from other prayers and maybe setting it to new music. And I'm kind of wondering almost about the mirror image of that, where we might have new words, but they're set to themes that on a deep way make people feel like, I know what this song is about, even beyond the words.
What a great question. I think what you said about Kol Nidre is exactly the point. Not only do we know that the words are not conveying the meaning, but we've experienced every year exactly what you say, Dan, that the sound of that melody, the arrangement of those notes tells me, right, it's time to forgive and it's time to be forgiven. And that is the meaning of that. Obviously, we're talking about just like two vectors of meaning. And I think we get to choose. I mean, because I was raised in a reform setting with like a real emphasis on informed choice, I think we get to choose. There's plenty of words that I say or that I recite or that I, read to myself or in a communal prayer setting where I'm like, yeah, these words are kind of hard for me to say. I don't know if I believe this. I don't know if I believe that. Is that really what this says and what this means? But I find meaning either in the singing of this particular melody because it conveys a different, or as you're saying with Kol Nidre, maybe even opposite meaning. Or I find meaning in the saying of these words, the act of saying the words, even though their essential meaning maybe is something that I'm struggling with. There are at least two, if not more, vectors of meaning that are going on in music that has words. One of the pieces that you have in your toolkit as a composer of music, particularly where you're setting words that pre-exist, like a sacred music kind of situation, one of the choices you make is, am I writing musical material that I feel like is to suit these, like to support and suit the literal meaning of these words? Or am I trying to propose something that's a little bit in tension with these words and have people consider that tension and what does it feel like? It's one of those things of, in the music theoretical world that you're sort of forced to learn all this theory and whatever, so that that when you're breaking it on purpose, you're doing it with some intentional meaning. And so, I definitely do think a lot about, I feel pretty strongly that whatever melodic choices that you're making or other musical choices that you're making, if you're setting a pre-existing sacred text, I want there to be a reason that the melody is the way that it is. Not just that it sounds nice or that I like the way it feels in this part of my voice, but that either that this is a prayer about peace, and so this is a peaceful sounding melody, or actually the settings that Lex, that you sang before, are not peaceful. Those are different kinds of settings of Oseh Shalom. Those are sort of, sometimes really agitated and very urgent kind of settings of Oseh Shalom, or ecstatic, jubilant, rhythmic settings of Oseh Shalom. And so I'm a real believer in the idea that the music carries as much of the midrash on the text as anything else. And if there's one thing that I'm trying to drill into people who come to study with me about writing, I need there to be a midrash. I love listening to all different kinds of music, and I don't require this of all music, but music with liturgical language, because of its tradition and its age and the generations, I need the person to be communicating a point of view or a midrash through the melody. And I think it absolutely can be in complete opposition to the sound, to the words, the sound of the melody. But then I want that to be for a reason, that to make me think about something.
Yeah, wow, we really agree on this. I mean, I go so back and forth on precisely what Dan's talking about. I think, Dan, like, what's funny is I honestly think a lot of scholars would agree with what you say. Like, I think there are some folks who would really be living in the words that make up prayer. And when you ask them the big question, what's the meaning of this? I mean, like, I think for some people, the answer to what's the meaning of, insert any Jewish prayer, like Mad Libs, the answer to that question is what the Hebrew words say. Right. It's different for each prayer, but like the answer to what Hashkivenu means is, well, it's this prayer about protection. And like, if you look at the words, it's about protection. Okay, fine. To other people, when they hear, I'll just like a Craig Taubman's Hashkivenu, which is a very widely circulated Hashkivenu, like their meaning for that prayer is melody that I have sung my whole life. It makes me think of a particular family member of mine, particular friends of mine that I've sung it with, a particular summer camp I went to. Like, it's actually, the meaning is that. It's not the words. Like, if you ask folks what the meaning of Hashkivenu is, and they respond that way, I don't think they're wrong. I think they're giving a meaning that is not universally recognizable outside of them. But people do and should have sort of personal meanings for prayers. What I struggle with is like, I do actually think some of the words of the prayers are worth either internalizing when I like them or fighting with when I don't like them, as in Kol Nidre. Like, I think that it's like a beautiful spiritual act to really be in the words and not just in the melodies. And I think what we've done is create communities who are more connecting to melodies a lot of the time than to words. And it's not that we shouldn't be connecting to melodies and we should only be connecting to words. I think that's something that is often a tension between leaders of spaces, and like a lot of people, they want to bring new melodies so that the meaning can not live only in the melody. And then the community is like, no, don't do that. I think that it's like the tension of a lot of Jewish communal singing. I wanted to dwell on Misha Berach really briefly. And like, you started to describe something that happened where right now, Debbie Friedman's Misha Berach is in the prayer book for the Reform movement. And I think even for the conservative movement, it might be in the prayer book. I'm not sure. When I was growing up, I think a lot of us remember, and Greg Drinkwater has actually like wrote about this, a lot of us remember that Debbie Friedman's Misha Berach was on a little piece of paper inserted into the prayer book. It was not yet part of the prayer book, but it was really widely utilized at first in Reform communities and then beyond. And then what happens is exactly what happens with Jewish music. It starts as like, ooh, this edgy, new, interesting melody that's outside the prayer book, but which we are using as like a supplement or we're inserting. And then it becomes just, that's what this melody is. And then people come around like you and others, and it's not so much a rebellion, but there's a sense of, what if we had other musical settings to this prayer that are not just that one? And that's where I've started to hear a lot of people like viscerally anti Debbie Friedman Misha Berach. Ugh, that's been so overdone. And I'm like, well, do you know the story of it? It started and was circulated so widely because it was written in a time of the AIDS epidemic, where Debbie Friedman herself was deeply connected to LGBTQ communities, and she saw a need for a prayer that was about healing. A lot of communities were not saying a Misha Berach for healing at all. That's actually, like, Misha Berach does not mean prayer for healing. It's a set of blessings that are all sorts of different needs. And she met that need. And it was so needed in the 80s and 90s that it circulated everywhere. And then it circulated so much that people actually don't know the story of it. They don't know the origin. And they're not wrong, right? So, like, I'd love to hear, like, they're right that it's taken on a meaning that isn't just its origin story, and that new melodies are lovely. And so I guess, like, as we're starting to arc towards the close of the episode, I'd love to hear your reflections on, like, how we navigate all this. How do we actually sort of start to apply what we're talking about?
Yeah. I think in some ways this tension is a microcosm of many of the other tensions that the Jewish community holds. We want to be particular. I think that we have this, on the one hand, very specific kind of idea of identity. On the other hand, we have this desire to feel this sort of broad, inclusive, communal embrace. Like in some ways, I find in my lifetime the sort of much more popularization of communal singing circles, right? What Joey Weisenberg and Deborah Sachs-Mintz and many of my friends, have kind of brought into a lot of the popular consciousness of people my age and younger. That is a radical thing because that's not necessarily hadn't been part of our regular culture. Maybe people sit around their Shabbat tables and singing songs, but like I'm going to come to a place where I may not know people and we're going to sit in a circle and we're going to sing for a long time, maybe without any words, and I'm going to feel something meaningful. And it's perhaps going to be a Jewish feeling that I'm going to have, is a kind of a radical thing in that it sort of acknowledges the way that we're so fragmented and that it is so countercultural to come together in a room and do it for the sole purpose of experiencing this unifying thing. What you said before earlier, Lex, I thought was so powerful. The idea that, hearing people's voices singing in unison is one of the great unifying experiences that you can have in a sensory way as a person. And it's rare, even for me, that's my job, is to do that. And it's not like every single day of my life I'm getting to go into a room and have that experience. This desire to be both a very particular, specific thing, whether it's a Jew in the broader world or whether it's my particular type of Jew in my particular community that sings this particular melody, or someone who never goes into synagogue, or someone who mostly expresses Judaism in the synagogue. We have this desire to be at the same time having this very unique particular experience, and then also to be connected to this broad, universal, communal, expansive experience. I don't know how we sort of solve the resistances that we've identified. I think they're, as I've said a few times, they're sort of embedded in culture, Jewish and beyond, in a way that's like really our struggle right now. And as someone who leads in those kinds of spaces, I think that part of my responsibility is to, in a really visible and obvious way, hold and acknowledge those multiple ways of being. So I may come into a space and I've got a new fill in the blank piece that I really want to share. That cannot be my motivation in that space. My motivation in that space needs to be a much higher order thing. So I'm holding on the one hand that sort of universalist biggest embrace. And I think part of my role as a person who, believes in and makes new melodies and new settings for these sort of sacred entry points, to then in the comfort of those spaces when people feel really open, to then also hold up this very specific and particular thing and allow people to engage with it in a new way and say, the old and the new and the this and the that, we've got space for all of that.
So I kind of want to come full circle. We started with you sharing a beautiful story about how your starting point was not Jewish music, and that, Debbie Friedman was nudging you towards it, which, like, what a surreal thing to have crazy. Like the preeminent person in a particular field be like, hey, get going in this. Like, we need you. I kind of want to come back to that because maybe this is just me. I don't think it is, but I will speak just for me and potentially for, like, I love singing melodies that are like meant to be Jewish, right? Like I love, I write some of them, I sing loads of them by others. I really enjoy the process of mobilizing quote unquote secular songs or pop song, or whatever it might be, for Jewish purposes. And I bring it up not because that specific thing is so interesting, but because I think it points to something bigger about Jewish life. You talked about how what is Jewish music intersects with, who is a Jew or what is a Jew. There's also a way in which what is Jewish music allows us to ask questions about like where Judaism lives. I'm somebody who look, I can go to a synagogue, I can go to a JCC, I can go to a Jewish, I can be at places that have like Jewish in their names on building placards. But for whatever reasons, it's not better or worse, I like what it feels like to be Jewish in a place that is not marked as Jewish. There's a reason that, I started a Shavuot gathering at an IHOP that we do every year. And there's a reason why I like programming in Zoom. And there's a reason why, in my neighborhood that is not at all seen as the Jewish neighborhood, I get a kick out of hosting services in my backyard and knowing that people are in a busy neighborhood walking by and like, oh, there's like what's happening over there? And like maybe seeing our
Totally.
yarmulkes. And I like that. And I think it links to the ways in which I enjoy, not just as a kitschy thing. It's sometimes done in a kitschy way. Oh, we're going to grab the latest pop song and float in, but actually as like a ritual push to find deep meaning in pop songs. I've recently been doing it with the song Unholy by Sam Smith and Kim Petras from a few years ago. It's actually written in a mode, the Fragish. It's written in a sound that people hear as Jewy sounding. It's also Middle Eastern sounding. And its title is Unholy. And it's actually, two marginalized people, two trans folks, trans or non-binary folks, sort of pushing back on what holiness means, what unholiness means. And I have been mobilizing that a lot for certain melodies in services. And people find it kitschy at first, but once I talk about it a little, they're like, oh, this is kind of a real prayer act. And so as a close, I'd love to ask, to what degree is there not really a separation at all between Jewish music and everything else? Are we overstating this? And might we benefit from noticing the ways in which Jewish music is also broader music in the same way that Jewish people are people?
Yeah. I definitely resonate with what you're saying. There's a particular kind of feeling and zing of, like you're saying, leading the services in your backyard and knowing that people are kind of walking by and hearing the sounds and wondering about it, that you're not in the Jewish neighborhood, but you're creating a Jewish space. And I think there is something really special in that. Yes, ultimately, we probably are making some artificial boundaries that don't exist.
We love boundaries that don't exist at
Yes,
Unbound.
exactly. That's your whole thing, I'm sure. I also really, really love, did you use the word deploying?
I might have. It's a word that folks in Jewish Renewal use a lot. And
I like the idea of deploying it because deploying a quote unquote secular song or a pop song or a song not, that's not Jewish and bringing it into a Jewish space and into Jewish context. Listen, that is the tradition of those German bar songs and the music that Debbie Friedman wrote in the, 60s, 70s, 80s. That is about using the language, musical language of folk music, the music of the people, right? That's the same thing as certain prayers being in Aramaic, because that's the language that people spoke, right? We're trying to find people and get people and connect to people where they are. And the concept of folk music or folk art is just of the people. And so in a lot of ways, using any kind of contemporary, whether it's pop song or folk song, or even, I've heard people beautifully render pieces of, music that comes from musical theater, even if it's, again, it can easily tip into, kitschy and performative, and it's not my vibe. There's lots of synagogues that like to do Adon Olam to the tune of whatever, okay, that's fine. That's a different thing than I think we're talking about, which is, again, deploying the resonance of something that's in popular culture or that's exists outside in the broader world and connecting it to the things that feel essentially Jewish. I think that is really a very powerful tool. And I think it's also interesting, as you're saying, I think what you're saying is that you're using, let's say, Unholy as a melody in a few different places in the service, in a few different ways.
In different. I mean, I don't think I've used it more than once in one service, but I have. But there are moments where I do things as a repeated mantra.
Yes. And I think that it's kind of an interesting trajectory to notice that probably often what happens is that people are kind of a little uncomfortable and think it's kitschy and weird. And by the third time you're doing it, people are moved. We do tend to not really enjoy, as humans, something new and different as our first, gut. The tension of singing these words that are supposed to be holy and important and different than the words that I am speaking in my regular life, and they're printed in this book and they're in this other language. I think that there's a discomfort with kind of bringing together the, like in the Havdalah blessing, the sacred and the profane. I always thought that was so funny. The profane is the opposite of sacred. you're not bringing like a profanity, laden piece that's like disrespectful. You're bringing something normal, quote unquote, and marrying it to something sacred. And to me, that just gives me an opportunity as a person to reflect on, oh, this is something that I knew in this other context. And now I feel this sort of sacred connection, this holy, this elevation, and maybe things all around me can be that way. I think in a lot of ways, it's a way to expand people's awareness, of what can take on that meaning. Also, I'm thinking about the feeling of ecstatic, holy connection that you witness when you go to like a stadium show of some pop singer that you like. I just recently took my daughter to see Gracie Abrams, who's a wonderful songwriter, Jewish, by the way, but not a Jewish musician, maybe, or not Jewish music, maybe, playing at Madison Square Garden. It was really exciting. This is a young artist who was for the first time headlining this huge stadium and sold it out. And there was the fans are like 12, 13, 14-year-old people and their parents and some older people too. But, when you look around in a stadium of people in a particular part of their life, singing every single word at the top of their lungs and closing their eyes and swaying, people are crying, it's like they're experiencing this feeling of deep connection to this huge room of people. Everybody knows the words. They're singing them together. They're singing the melody. They're like moving their bodies. Like there's a part of the device in secular music that is the absolute goal, I think, for any kind of a sacred space, which is like, forget that I'm myself and allow myself to be part of something bigger, whether it's a sense of something divine or a sense of something bigger than myself in terms of God, or whether it's about a sense of belonging to something, a community, and not feeling alone, whatever those particular needs are. There's a way in which, a really beautifully executed pop music experience is like the ultimate kind of sacred space. And I was really thinking about it when I was looking around in this concert recently with my daughter. I loved the music and I was super into it. And it was a great musical experience just on its own. But there was something really holy about watching particularly young people in this maybe first experience of what does it feel like where everyone in the stadium, thousands of people are singing at the same time and just feeling free. There's something aspirational there that maybe is also what you tap into when you bring, Sam Smith into a service.
Thank you so much, Elana Arian, for joining us. This has been an amazing kickoff to what I know is going to be an awesome unit.
Thank you so much. What a pleasure to talk to you. And I'm really excited to hear the whole series.
Us as well. We can't wait for the remainder of the episodes in this unit on Jewish music. Thanks to Elana Arian for joining us, and thanks to all of you out there for listening. As we close, a couple little reminders. First, Judaism Inbound. It's your very last chance to sign up for our Intro to Judaism course. You can do so at judaismunbound.com/classes, and financial aid is available. It already began, but you can sign up now, watch back the recording of the first class, and then join for the rest of the way. You will not be able to do that once the second class occurs in a few days. So register now. Also, we have 4 amazing other classes in the Onion Yeshiva that have not started yet that will be starting in a couple weeks. You can sign up at that same link. Financial aid is also available for them. So head to judaismunbound.com/classes to learn about these amazing course offerings in the Onion Yeshiva. Another quick announcement, Shabbat Unbound, our year-long Shabbat service where each time we hone in on one particular prayer and give you the chance to really learn about it deeply as opposed to just running through super quickly a bunch of prayers. You can register for our first gathering of our second run of Shabbat Unbound. We did 1 year-long service last year, the first ever, and now we're doing a follow-up. So that is on October 10th, and you can sign up for that by heading to judaismunbound.com/Shabbat. In addition to those programmatic pieces, we're always super interested in hearing from our listeners. You can be in touch in any of the following ways. First, there's our Facebook and Instagram handles. Both of those are at Judaism Unbound. Second, there's our website, judaismunbound.com, where you can find show notes for this episode, all sorts of other juicy goodies. And you can email us at dan@judaismunbound.com or lex@judaismunbound.com. We hope that your Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur were super meaningful and that you're gearing up, hopefully, for an incredible Sukkot as well. Thanks so much for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.